up for his that I'm introducing Marek Tamm today. Marek Tamm is professor of cultural history at Tallinn University and one of today's leading scholars in the field of philosophy of history. He has published extensively in some of the best well-known international journals on topics concerning medieval and early modern European culture, on memory, and more recently on time and historical futures. I came across Marek's work a few years ago when I was preparing a graduate course on theory of history. As I told him on an email, my students at the time found his work on historical truth both soothing and very appealing. It was soothing because it gave an alternative, more realistic and feasible account of historical truth. But it was also appealing because it considers what historians actually do, their actual practice, and not what some philosophers of history think it should be or imagine it to be. So thank you, Marek, for joining us today and for sharing some of your research with us. The stage is yours now.
Yeah, thank you, Aurelia. And it is, of course, a great pleasure to be here, first time, even if only virtually, in Mexico. And thank you for the invitation. And I will share my screen and the slides. So I hope it works. Now, indeed, as Aurelia suggested, I will focus on the problems of truth in history. But let's say that my presentation will have two main aims. First, on the very general level, I will make a case for a pragmatist philosophy of history. And I do believe indeed that we need a kind of practical and pragmatic turn in the philosophy of history. And that we might learn a great deal from the philosophical and linguistic pragmatism. And then secondly, on a more concrete level, I would like to analyze the nature and function of historical, or more precisely, historiographical assertion in the writings of historians, especially in relation to the issue of truth. To give you an overview, I will have 6 main points with a prologue and epilogue. I will start with some very general reflections about how to study philosophy of history, and will then turn toward the general issues of pragmatism and philosophy of history. And then in the second part, as promised, I will focus more on the issues of truth and historiographical assertion. But yes, let me start with some very general reflections about the ways of studying of philosophy of history. And to make a long story very short, one could distinguish between 2 basic approaches in the philosophy of history. One is normative and the other descriptive philosophy of history. And of course, these are very ideal, typical distinctions, and there is any pure form of these normative and descriptive philosophies. But roughly, let's say that normative philosophy of history make claims about how things should or ought to be in history writing, while descriptive philosophy of history attempts to make sense of what historians are actually doing. And in a way, descriptive philosophy of history takes as its starting point a claim that historians possess kind of tacit knowledge, as Karl Polanyi once called it, that meaning that, like other professionals, historians can practice their job without fully knowing what they are actually doing. And so the role of the philosophy is to make explicit the work of historians. But another way to convey the same message is to distinguish between, let's say, dogmatic and pragmatist approach to philosophy of history. And here I'm relying on a quite recent article by American philosopher Serge Grigoriev in his article, A Pragmatist Critique of Dogmatic Philosophy of History. And yes, the argument is very similar, namely that dogmatists tend to use history to exemplify some pre-existing philosophical convictions, while pragmatists want to construe philosophy of history as a form of critical reflection on the actual historical practice. And so for pragmatists, history is primarily as a special and advanced mode of inquiry, which generates important philosophical problems of its own. And this kind of approach also is built on the idea of epistemic autonomy of history, which has been advocated many times. Probably one of the first authors to make a very strong argument for this epistemic autonomy or even authority of history is American philosopher Leon Goldstein in his book Historical Knowing. And yes, he says that that we have to take the discipline of history seriously on its own terms, and we should kind of agree that historians are able to produce claims to knowledge that are responsible and warranted. And therefore, again, as he says, that the proper task of philosophy of history is to tell us about how the presently practiced discipline of history carries out its work. And again, I will very much follow this line of argument. But also more recently, one of the most prominent contemporary philosophers of history, Frank Ankerschmidt, has made a similar argument, saying that doing philosophy of history is doing philosophy of history, and not putting history on the Procrustes bed constructed by some guru in analytic philosophy, philosophy of language, or philosophy of science, while carelessly chopping off feet and head of historical writing where these stick out of the bed. So the same is argument for the certain autonomy of historical knowing to be analyzed in its own terms. So these opening statements very much point toward a need for a, let's call it, practical turn in the philosophy of history. And actually, this kind of practical, also practice turn, has been carried out in many fields of social sciences and humanities. You have here just a almost random list of some articles and books claiming practical turn, a practice turn, a certain field of study, be it in psychology, in theory in general, in philosophy of social sciences, in logic, in theater research, but also in political theory and in media studies. So there's something going on across disciplines, wanting to focus more on the practice in one or other concrete field of study. And what is this practice turn, a practice approach? I use here a quote from the introduction to an edited volume titled The Practice Turn in Contemporary Theory, which claims that the practice approach is based on the belief that such phenomena as knowledge, meaning, human activity, science, power, language, social institutions, and historical transformation occur within and are aspects of or components of the field of practices. And so let's say that the idea is to put practice first. From my perspective, probably the most relevant practical turn is the one that took place in science studies. This practical turn was announced already in 1970s, but let's say the culmination of this practice or practical turn was in 1990s. And we had quite a few important publications, such as Andrew Pickering's edited volume Science as Practice and Culture, but also Joseph Rouse's book from 2002, How Scientific Practices Matter. And Andrew Pickering, who is an British philosopher and historian of science, captures the main idea behind this practical turn in science studies, saying that it is a move towards studying scientific, scientific practice, what scientists actually do, and the associated move towards studying scientific culture, meaning the field of resources that practice operates in and on. And in my mind, the historical science or history of writing, historical research needs the similar kind of practical turn. Maybe most relevant scholar within the science studies who has also written a lot about the philosophy of history is John Zamito, American philosopher. And he also explains in this quote this practical turn as a shift from conceiving of science as knowledge to conceiving of science as practice. And also he elaborates on this normative and descriptive approach in philosophy, emphasizing the importance of descriptive approach. So Zamito is one of the authors who has inspired me a great deal in elaborating my own stance. Now, of course, we can ask whether we have noticed any call for a practical turn in the philosophy of history. And the answer is yes and no. There is some examples, some of them very interesting examples, for arguing for some kind of practical approach. I picked up 3 examples. For instance, an American philosopher, Raymond Martin, published in 1989 a book called The Past Within Us, an empirical approach to philosophy of history, which also very much argues for, indeed, the empirical approach, which is focused on historians' doing. But it's not pragmatist in its approach, and therefore not very useful for myself. But yes, however, he wanted to shift the attention toward historiographical practice. Another interesting example comes also from an American philosopher, Martin Bunzel, the book called Real History, Reflections on Historical Practice. And this book is also very critical toward this kind of metaphysical realism and positivism, and argues for a real or realist philosophy of history focused on historical practice. But for my own research, probably the most interesting recent attempt to call for a practice approach in philosophy of history is Dutch scholar Herman Paul, and especially his article Performing History from 2011. And he called for a performative approach and even called for a performative turn in philosophy of history. And it means that we should analyze history writing as a performance in terms of epistemic virtues. And so he has been focused very much on this epistemic culture and epistemic virtues such as honesty, carefulness, accuracy, and balance, and has produced a lot of interesting also historical studies about the changes in historical epistemic cultures and in the system of epistemic virtues. But again, I think this article is important to build up my own argument. Now, especially in the context of science studies and philosophy of science, the main philosophical ally of practical turn has been naturalism, which is, as you know, one of the well-known philosophical stances. And to give you a definition from Joseph Rawls, naturalism is the claim that philosophical reflection should be continuous with, or perhaps even a part of, empirical science. Again, that historians are not exploring the science from outside, but rather from inside, in continuity with scientific research. And also, John Zamito has added that naturalism is about the inescapability of empirical inquiry, that the philosophy of science cannot be grounded in first philosophy, but on the object of study of this one particular scientific discipline. What is interesting that also recently we have seen certain interest toward naturalism in the philosophy of history. And here I'm referring to a colleague of mine in Finland at the University of Oulu, Jouni-Matti Kuukkanen. He published recently an article, Naturalism and the Problem of Normativity, the case of historiography. And on the one hand, he also very much follows, let's say, my line of thinking, that this history is about making performative acts, kind of proposals of how to view the past. But on the other hand, he espouses the naturalist stance and more specifically argues for a weak naturalism. I won't go into details of his article, but something worth of reading for those who are interested in this discussion about naturalism in contemporary philosophy of history. Now, let me move toward the main issue, namely the pragmatism and the pragmatic philosophy of history. And indeed, I would claim that the practical or practice turn I've been advocating so far is necessarily bringing along another turn, namely pragmatic turn, to borrow this concept from Richard Bernstein's book, The Pragmatic Turn from 2010. And I believe indeed that practical turn is a kind of first step toward pragmatic turn, toward building pragmatist philosophy of history. And I also give you here a quote from American philosopher James Kloppenberg, who I think pointedly claimed that pragmatism is the unofficial philosophy for most historians. And I believe this is indeed the case, that historians are pragmatists by nature, but the problem is that most of them are not aware of this. So I think there is a sort of duty of philosophers maybe to make explicit the pragmatic stance of most of the history writing. But maybe this is another issue we will not tackle so much, at least in my paper, but something to keep in mind. So, of course, I will not be able to explain what is pragmatism, and probably you don't have to. You don't need to have this explanation, but let me just stress two main points from my perspective. What is pragmatism? What pragmatism is about? And I would say that pragmatism is characterized by the practical starting point. So this is what we have been discussing so far. So pragmatism analyzes philosophical problems and concepts in practical and experiential terms. It relies on the idea of an epistemological primacy of practices in explaining theoretical entities. But on top of this, very important is also this pragmatist idea that language is best understood as a social practice. That language is a form of action rather than a device for describing the world. And this performative idea of language is also the foundation for my understanding of the historiographic assertion. Needless to say, I'm not exactly the first one to be interested in pragmatist philosophy of history. And of course, pragmatism has been quite popular in various fields of philosophy, like in political philosophy, in moral philosophy, recent years also in aesthetics. And also there have been some attempts to formulate a platform for pragmatist philosophy of history, but still, I believe, much needs to be done. So I give you here just a few references, a few names who have contributed toward building up this pragmatist philosophy of history. I already mentioned, I believe, David Hildebrand and James Kloppenberg, the two American scholars who have been writing about the need for a pragmatic approach in philosophy of history. And also more recently, quite a few scholars from different perspectives have tackled the issue of pragmatism in philosophy of history. I also mentioned just here a few works. For instance, 2016, there was a special issue of the European Journal of Pragmatism and American Philosophy titled Pragmatism and the Writing of History, started by some Argentinian colleagues, if I'm not mistaken. And this is one of the first special issues on this topic and available online. But then also I wanted to point out one particular article by a Korean scholar, Yong-Pil Yoon, in the journal Contemporary Pragmatism, where he tries to discuss the contemporary discussions of pragmatism in history, including, by the way, my own work from a critical perspective. So it's a kind of interesting contribution to this ongoing debate and discussion. And he also considers pragmatism as a useful approach to overcome the sterile dichotomy between objectivism and relativism. And also one important recent contribution is a special issue of the Journal of the Philosophy of History about pragmatism and philosophy of history, co-edited by Serge Grigoriev and Robert Percy. It is mostly, let's say, history-oriented in the sense that it covers the previous legacy of pragmatism in relation to philosophy of history, the works of James and Dewey and Ortega. But it is, so far the latest contribution to the philosophy, pragmatist philosophy of history. And I wanted to actually point out important work, ongoing work of one of the co-editors of this special issue, Serge Grigoriev, who is Russian-born American philosopher, who has been exploring in recent years the pragmatist tradition in philosophy history, and is now also writing some first general overviews. For instance, he recently wrote an article for the forthcoming Routledge Companion to Historical Theory, coming out next month or so. and also is now currently writing a short book on pragmatism for the Historical Theory and Practice series of Cambridge University Press Element series. Now, let me move on and start to explain a bit more my own stance in these discussions. First, I have to admit that I have a very comprehensive approach to the pragmatic perspective in the philosophy of history. And more specifically, I would point out three main layers of meaning of this pragmatic perspective. First, by pragmatic perspective in the philosophy of history, I have in mind this practical perspective, practice-based perspective I've been discussing in the first part of my talk. So it's a perspective that is built on this historiographical practice. And also in my case, probably should emphasize that I am not a philosopher by education. I'm an historian with strong philosophical interests, but still my point of departure is the practical empirical work of an historian. And just I try to make sense of this work by using various conceptual philosophical tools. So this is first. Secondly, by pragmatic perspective in the philosophy of history, I have in mind the linguistic pragmatics approach, more specifically speech act theory as main foundation for the pragmatic stance in the philosophy of history. And I will come back on this in a minute. And then finally, last but not least, of course, by pragmatic perspective in the philosophy of history, I have in mind this pragmatist tradition of philosophy and this attempt to develop something that could be called a pragmatist philosophy of history. But all these three levels are equally important for me. Now, in this work, kind of building this pragmatic theory of philosophy, one of my main guides have been Robert Brandom, and also a well-known American philosopher, and also he has emphasized this interconnection between those three levels, the practical level, linguistic pragmatic level, and the pragmatist level. And from this book of his, Perspectives on Pragmatism, he also says that first, by pragmatism, he means, let's say, the explanatory priority of practice, and then secondly, explanatory priority of pragmatics over semantics. And then, of course, also the importance of the pragmatist philosophy as such. Now, to give you in a nutshell some first basic arguments in my thinking about philosophy of history from a pragmatic perspective. So I first would argue that history, meaning historical research, historical inquiry, should be considered as a certain socially constituted set of practices based on the mutual agreement of certain people, historians, and the audience. And this specific set of practices is built up with the help of rules and conventions known to and followed by all the participants in practice. So disciplinary rules and conventions. Then secondly, I would argue that history writing consists primarily of producing argumentative speech acts. In other words, the most fruitful way of analyzing history writing is by defining it as a performative practice that consists of making assertoric arguments that have a certain kind of effect. And I will elaborate on this in the following slides. So this leads us to this kind of concluding idea that one of the main questions in philosophy of history is what historians are doing when they assert something. In other words, philosophy of history shouldn't be studying only what historians say and how it relates to past reality, which is the traditional focus on the philosophy of history. It's kind of correspondence problem, but rather what historians are doing while they say it. That is the intention, function and illocutionary force of what they say. Now, this is probably a moment to explain very briefly the speech act theory, which I guess is known for most of you, but is still important to understand my argument. So speech act is an utterance that has performative function in language. And the speech act theory is based on this idea that language is a form of action rather than a device for describing the world, as said also previously. And speech act theory forces us to consider communication not simply as passing of information between a speaker and hearer or reader, but rather as the consequential and mutual acting of participants upon each other. And what is, of course, very important, that from the perspective of speech acts theory, speech acts are neither true nor false, but rather felicitous or infelicitous. And in the framework of this theory, to be felicitous, speech acts have to be produced in accordance with generalized felicity conditions. In other words, normal input and output conditions, the essential and sincerity conditions, and the particularized felicity conditions, in other words, proposition content condition. So this is, of course, needs to be elaborated much more, but I hope the main point is very clear that to say something is to do something. And in order to be successful in doing, you need to follow certain conditions. Now, I just as a preliminary idea, let me remind you the classification of main speech acts that was proposed already in 1975 by John Searle, well-known philosopher and one of the leading theorists of speech act theories. And so he makes this distinction between 5 main types of speech acts, following, of course, the work of G.L. Austin: expressives, directives, commissives, declaratives, and assertives. And again, there is no time nor need to go into each speech act, but let me focus on the last one, because I said in historiographical work, in the history of writing, the assertives are, in my mind, the key type of speech acts. And assertives, according to Searle, are these kind of speech acts which commit the speaker to the truth of the expressed proposition. And also Searle has elaborated sort of 4 basic rules of assertive speech act. And of course, the most important is the first one, what he calls the essential rule. The maker of an assertion commits himself to the truth of the expressed proposition. So let keep in mind this idea of commitment that I will come back to. But then also he proposes the preparatory rules. The speaker, in our case the historian, must be in a position to provide evidence or reasons for the truth of the expressed proposition. And then thirdly, the expressed proposition must not be obviously true to both the speaker and the hearer in the context of utterance. This is probably not that crucial in the context of history writing, but still somehow relevant. And finally, the sincerity rule. The speaker commits himself to a belief in the truth of the expressed proposition, which is very much about the, let's say, true intention of the speaker, or in our context of the historian. And I used this list of rules already in my article that I already mentioned, but I will, in this talk, go deeper in this idea of historical writing as making assertoric speech acts. So this will be now the last main chapter of my presentation, and I will try to connect the idea of truth and the idea of historiographical assertion in more details. So just remind you again the main arguments that I'm trying to provide proof in this talk. First, that history of writing is very much about making assertive illocutionary acts, and this also helps us to explain the function of truth in history of writing. And secondly, history of writing is about producing these augmentative speech acts, historiographical assertion with which the historian tries to do something. Now, yes, and now the important link is how historian is actually convincing his or her readers about his intention, about his commitment. And it is bound to evidence and justification or reason, as we will see. Here I wanted to give you a useful quote from yet another pragmatist philosopher, Cheryl Misak, from his article Pragmatism and Deflationism. And the main point is that he shows how deeply truth and assertion are connected, that actually we cannot make sense of truth, at least from a pragmatist perspective, without connecting it to assertion. And so in other words, to make sense of the function of assertion is also to make sense of truth in specific context of the using language. And yet another quote from Robert Brandom, we also helps to show to what extent the idea of truth is about the game of taking true and treating as true. So it's mostly about the doing of the speaker and about the recipient who takes something to be true or will not take something to be true. So the solution for the truth issue is very much about making sense of this communicative situation of taking true and treating as true. So now I will elaborate a little bit on this theory of assertion, which, as you understood, is, in my mind, the central argument about making sense of truth in history of writing. And of course, the notion of assertion and the theory of assertion is not a recent invention. It goes back at least to 19th century, and the key figure here is Gottlob Frege. And as you might remember, he first distinguished between a thought and a judgment, Gedanke and Urteil, and then this thought, this thought is expressed in sayings, and the judgment is expressed in assertions. And therefore, assertions, according to Frege, are manifestations of judgments. The concept of judgment is thus primary. And as we will see in a minute, indeed, the idea of judgment is critical in order to make sense of the role of assertions, also in historiographical context. But what is interesting and also important to notice that the question of assertion has become a very important topic in philosophy over the last few years, especially in the last decade. We have seen quite a few important studies being published on this topic. I will here emphasize particularly this edited collection by Jessica Brown and Herman Kappelen, Assertion, New Philosophical Essays from 2011, and then also the monograph by Sanford Goldberg, Assertion on the Philosophical Significance of Assertoric Speech. And in these works, let's say the central argument is that the assertion is becoming one of the most important topics, especially in the philosophy of language, but also in other branches of philosophy. And again, in my discussion, I very much rely on this recent scholarship. So to make things easy, one could say that there is two basic approaches to assertion. One is, let's say, traditionalist approach based on the work of Austin and Searle and other, especially speech act theorists. And then in this tradition, assertion is one of the many speech acts that speaking can be formed. As we noticed, Searle listed at least 5 of these. And then there is this more recent, let's call it fundamentalist approach to assertion, according to which assertion is the basic unit of analysis in the study of linguistic meaning, meaning that all other speech acts or other illusionary forces can be explained only in terms of assertoric force. And this stance has been adopted notably by Bob Frandom and also John McFarlane and some other scholars. I will, again, very much rely on their work. John McFarlane, who is, as I said, one of the leading scholars of linguistic philosophy today, former student of Robert Frandom, American philosopher. And in his article, What is Assertion?, he proposed sort of classification of assertions, how in contemporary philosophical landscape the assertions are being studied or being explained. So the first is attitudinal account. To assert means to express an attitude. Again, I will not go into details because not very much in the interest of my talk, but let's give an overview. So the second is common ground account. To assert is to propose to add information to the conversational common ground. Constitutive rule account. To assert is to make a move defined by its constitutive rules in a speech situation. And finally, that is my focus, to assert is to undertake a commitment. And I believe indeed that this commitment theory of assertion is the most useful in making sense of history writing. And actually, again, this commitment theory of assertion goes back to early days of pragmatist philosophy, goes back to Charles Sanders Peirce, who in his article Belief and Judgment from 1908 already emphasized the importance of commitment in explaining assertion, and also explained that assertion is very much about doing something. Also, in another article from 1902, he has this note, unpublished note, I quote, "An assertion is an act by which a person makes himself responsible for the truth of a proposition." But in more recent years, this commitment theory of assertion has been quite widely explored, most notably by, as I said, by Robert Frandom and John McFarlane. And so according to this commitment theory, the nature of assertion consists in the fact that in asserting, the speaker achieves 2 different normative results at the same time. On the one hand, he authorizes the hearer to claim anything that follows from what is asserted, and on the other, he undertakes the responsibility of justifying it. So it's got 2 different types of commitment. And maybe another important point, according to this commitment theorist, is that assertion should be accompanied by the relevant set of let's say, social commitments. That the hearer or the reader should recognize that the author has been undertaking the right kinds of commitments shared within the community. A few quotes to explain this commitment theory of assertion. So here the first quote from the most important book in the field by Robert Frandom, Making It Explicit, Reasoning, Representing and Discursive Commitment from 1994. So Frandom asks, what is it that we are doing when we assert, claim, or declare something? The general answer is that we are undertaking a certain kind of commitment. Saying specifically what kind is explaining what structure must be exhibited by the practices a community is interpreted as engaging in for that interpretation, to be recognizable as taking the practitioners to be keeping score for themselves and each other in virtue of the alterations of the practical theontic attitudes of attributing and undertaking assertional commitments on the corresponding entitlements. Long quote, but I think the idea is not that complicated, that there must be certain rules followed by the speaker and the community based on the idea of commitment. And this idea of commitment is according to Brandom, but also according to Frege, as we noticed earlier, based on the justificatory responsibility. In asserting a sentence, one not only licenses further assertions for others and for oneself, but commits oneself to justifying the original claim. So now we are dealing with the idea of justification. And what does it mean to justify something in historiographical context? And here I would rely on the work of John McFarlane, who has discussed in various articles this idea of let's say, connection between assertion and justification. And for him, indeed, commitment is very much about producing a justification, that is giving adequate reasons for thinking that the sentence is true. And also assertion for McFarlane's means providing adequate grounds for the truth of the assertion in response to any appropriate challenge. So the author of the assertoric speech acts has to be able to respond to appropriate challenges. More specifically, McFarlane proposes three kinds of commitment to truth in assertion in relation to justification. First is the commitment. The first commitment is to withdraw the assertion if and when it is shown to have been untrue. So the commitment principle requires that one has to give up the assertion when it is shown to have been untrue. And shown, of course, means, again, justified according to the rules of this particular discipline. Secondly, commitment to justify the assertion if and when it is appropriately challenged. So this is the very idea of the justification, that one should be able to justify the assertion, to provide evidence in the context of history writing more specifically. And third, commitment to be held responsible if someone else acts on reasons from what is asserted and proves to have been untrue. So the kind of development of the first argument, one has to be responsible, be committed to the assertion one makes. Another important dimension in understanding the function of the assertion and also historiographic assertion is to consider it as a public practice, as a performative act. And here I refer to the book by Rachel McKinnon, The Norms of Assertion, Truth, Lies, and Warrant. And indeed, she claims well that there is no sense to assert something to a tree, for instance. So assertion happens between humans in a public situation. And this idea of responsibility and commitment makes sense only in the social context. So this brings me closer to this, to defining the historical assertion. And I use here first as a kind of motto, an idea from Robin Collingwood almost a century ago, that you must not say as a historian anything, however true, for which you cannot produce evidence. So here we see that history is not about telling true things, but about providing justification and personal commitment to this justification. And this commitment and this justification makes one's argument true in historiographical sense. So again, relying on the work of Robert Brandom, one could define two basic felicity conditions of a correct, or let's say true, historical assertion. First is related to condition of entitlement. Historian must have justification for what he or she asserts. He or she must be entitled by some objectively recognizable grounds. And secondly, this commitment condition, historian must commit himself or herself to the consequences of what she or he asserts, given his or her mastery of the conditional relation. So this also includes this public or social dimension. Put differently, the illocutive force, or let's say the true intention of historical assertion, is based on the one hand on the historian's work with the evidence, on providing justification, on the critical analysis and conceptual interpretation of the evidence, and on the second hand on historian's commitment and on his or her entitlement to that commitment. So this is the very, let's say, gist or essence of the argument of historical assertion. But I would like to dwell a bit more on this performative and social dimension of the historiographical assertion, and again defining it in terms of action, of doing, and in terms of its performative properties. And while again normally most of the historical philosophical discussions about truth turn out to be semantic discussions, my argument is that truth is mostly a pragmatic issue, and to understand the function of truth, we have to understand it in terms of performance. The social dimension is also important to take into account the social context, also institutional context, that is very much the backdrop of making an assertoric arguments. So it's always situated in a specific institutional social situation that also makes this assertoric speech act convincing or felicitous. And I would like to conclude with very complex and technical definition of the historiographical assertion, which is very much which summarizes all I've been talking about so far, but also is still a kind of definition in progress. It relies partly on the work of Patrick Greenough, especially his article Truth Relativism, Norm Relativism and Assertion. So we can say that an assertion of a sentence S by a subject S in the context of use C is true relative to context of assessment A, if and only if S is in a position in the context of assessment A to defend this assertion when appropriately challenged in A by giving reasons to think that the proposition expressed by A use of S in C is true in the circumstances of evaluation determined by both C and A. So probably not easy to understand. We might want to read it carefully later. Of course, important is to understand that S means historian, C fixes the world of evaluation, and A fixes the epistemic standards in historical discipline. So I don't believe that we actually have to end up with such kind of technical definitions, but it may be useful to have in a nutshell the whole long argument I try to explain today. So this is the short theory of historiographical assertion. And now let me just conclude by a few more general remarks. First, I believe that we have this sort of need for a pragmatic turn in the philosophy of history. And this pragmatic turn in the philosophy of history would mean a shift of attention from theory to practice, from representation to presentation, from saying to doing, from semantics to pragmatics. And the list remains, of course, open. And these shifts, I believe, would lay the foundations of a pragmatist philosophy of history, still very, very little explored among the philosophers of history. Now, doesn't want to give me, try again. So the second point is that actually we don't need a new theory of philosophy of truth. I think we need actually to understand in theoretical terms how history writing functions, and more specifically, what is the actual function of truth in the practice of historical inquiry. And my main argument was that in order to understand in theoretical terms the actual function of truth, we need a concept of historiographic assertion, which explains the mechanism of truth-making in history writing. So, in other words, the best way to understand the truth in history writing is to consider it as an intentional category of certain type of illocutionary act, namely assertion, in a certain specific historiographical context of assessment. And in a way, I would argue that with this kind of approach, the whole long history of defining historical truth will just dissolve or disappear. So that's it. Thank you for your patience. It wasn't probably very easy to follow, a lot of long quotations, a lot of very abstract thinking. I'm very sorry about this. Actually, normally I try to avoid to abstract the statements, but well, as I was asked to talk to philosophers, as I understood, I try to be more philosophical than normally. Thank you.
Thank you, Marek, for your wonderful talk. We already have a few people lining up for questions, so if you agree, we might start right away with the Q&A part of this session. So first we have Raimundo Morado.
Thank you for the talk. It's very interesting to see these subjects. But I think it's very prudent to have a minimalist attitude towards philosophical commitments. That is, the least that we have to buy into a theory for our theoretical purposes, the better. Just a cautionary attitude. So if I understand, you have an idea of assertion in the historiographical studies that doesn't need to extrapolate to all other forms of the use of assertion and all the dealing with truth. For instance, if I say, I am tired, better yet, if you ask me, how do you feel, Raimundo? And I say, oh, I feel tired. And then you ask me, how can you prove it? What is your evidence? I will say, I don't know, didn't think about that. I'm not committing myself to be able to prove it, but you ask me, so I'm telling you. Now, if I say, during Napoleon's famous nap during the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon took the nap because he was tired. You say, Raimundo, how do you know that? He had been having some stomach problems. Maybe that was the reason he took a nap. How do you know he was tired? And I thought, I don't know. I have no idea. I'm just saying. Then you say, this is not a proper historiographical activity. I'm doing history wrong because historiographical assertions are of a special kind, and we don't need to commit ourselves to having this strong commitment to providing evidence in all other forms of assertion. So if I follow you, we wouldn't need to call this a pragmatist theory of truth. It's just an analysis of the commitments of the practice of history itself. Whether I am pragmatist or not, that's irrelevant. That could be orthogonal, and that way we could minimize our commitments. Am I following you correctly?
Yes, thank you. I mean, yeah.
All the way.
I believe we are very much on the same page. Namely, I do agree also that historiographic assertion is a very specific kind of assertion, very specific kind of speech act. And this was very much my idea, to try to, demonstrate the specificity of historiographical assertion, and even to provide a sort of definition of historiographic assertion, which is different from other assertions. In a way, I do agree, and I even mentioned it in my talk, that a lot of historians are doing, let's say, are sharing the pragmatist stance without knowing it. So, but my claim is that why do we need historical theory is to conceptualize in theoretical terms what historians are doing. And therefore, even if historians are not knowing that they are doing, that they are making a assertoric speech act, I believe it useful to translate their activity into theoretical terms and show that actually it is about assertoric speech acts. And therefore, we can analyze these assertoric activities with the help of conceptual tools developed in linguistic philosophy. So it's very much about making explicit what historians are doing. And I think this is something important to be able to conceptualize one's, let's say, empirical activity. But also concerning your example, in the first case, when you say that I'm tired, this is not necessarily an assertoric speech act. It is indeed a speech act, but I think for instance, in the classification of John Searle, it would be rather, I believe, expressive. It's expressing certain psychological situation, attitude. I don't know. I mean, it's up to, let's say, discussion, but not necessarily each speech act should be considered as assertion, because again, there are different kinds of speech acts. But otherwise, yes, the main thing is indeed, I think first that historiographic assertion is a very specific kind of speech act, which needs to be defined in a proper way. But on the other hand, we still need these kind of theoretical discussions in order to make explicit the historiographic work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Guillermo Mortado.
Yes, hello.
Hi.
My question, I think, somehow related to Raimundo's question. And what I find is a certain internal tension inside your position, inside your argument. You claim that your position is based, on the one hand, on the practical turn in philosophy of science in general, and on the other hand, in the pragmatic turn in philosophy of language. So on the first part of your talk, you described very eloquently that practical turn, claiming that when we do philosophy of history, we have to pay attention to what historians actually do. If I remember well, actually you said something like, beware of gurus, no? Beware of those philosophers that impose a certain view about history without taking into consideration what historians do. However, in the second part of your paper, what you do is exactly what you were attacking. Because let me see if I'm wrong, but you examine the pragmatic turn in philosophy of language, particularly Robert Brandam's theory, and from there you derive, you infer a certain view about what historical assertion and what historical truth is. So what I saw in your paper is that your position about your definition of historical assertion and historical truth depends on your defense of the pragmatic view of philosophy of language. To put it another way, you never gave any example of how historians work. No, although in the first part of your paper you said that you were going to take attention of how historians actually work. You arrived to your conclusion about what historical truth and historical assertion is, without giving any single example of how actual historians work. The only thing you say is that very general claim that in reality historians are pragmatic, but you never gave any example of that. You just assume it as a general idea. So what would you say about what I just told you?
Yeah, thank you very much. This was a very good question. Of course, this is the question I asked myself before starting my lecture, because there is indeed internal tension. But I think there is an explanation because I consider this work as indeed a kind of conceptual framework how to analyze the specific historiographical texts, and in elaborating this framework, I very much was based on my own work as an historian. So I was taking myself as the typical case, let's say, of an historian, and it was very much about reflecting on one's own job or one's own doings, and to let's say make the argument convincing. Indeed, there is one missing part, namely to analyze specific historiographic texts with the help of these tools that I try to elaborate in my, let's say, the first phases of my research. So indeed, I would say that under the water, my thinking was very much taking into account what historians are doing, because this is something that I do on an everyday basis. I work in the history department, I teach history, I publish history, so I consider myself historian. And in this respect, I was just I was looking for different theoretical conceptual tools around me, mostly from linguistic philosophy and from pragmatist philosophy, to make sense of my own work. And I believe that in the next step, once, let's say, applied to other historiographic texts, we can sort of prove that this sort of conceptual framework will work and will help to explain the function of truth in historiography. But otherwise, you are absolutely right. I mean, there was this sort of tension or paradox in my talk that I started by claiming that we should pay attention to historiographical practice, and then actually never refer to the proper historiographical practice, except, I'd say, hiddenly or implicitly to my own research, to my own work as an historian. But yes, thank you for pointing this out. This is important remark, and I think it's partly justified that indeed maybe my own practical turn has not been enough deep yet. And I'm still maybe too much under the influence of my philosophical readings. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we have Mariana Imas.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for your talk. It was super suggestive, and I don't know, it really got me thinking. My question is, I would like to press you a little bit on the normative side. I know this was more of like a descriptive project, but I would like to press you a little bit on the normative side of the project. So if we really sort of commit to this idea that, you know, truth in historiography is a matter of assertion, justification, and personal commitment to a view, I'm afraid that we sort of like might fall into what actually Kukkonen also worries, you know, and everything goes sort of view where we cannot really evaluate historical narratives, right? When they're sort of competing for interpretations. And if we say that truth is just, you know, a matter of commitment, what sort of normative standard can we use to actually evaluate historical narratives? Are there ethical standards? Are there epistemological standards, or even aesthetic standards in your view? So yeah, that's all.
Yeah, thank you. That's of course important question, and always raised, especially in relation to the pragmatist philosophy, that it ends up in total sort of relativism. And this was also one of the main critics of Richard Rorty, for instance. But let's say my take is as follows. I believe that the key is this history writing as a public practice, as a social practice, that has to follow certain rules within this social space, within the discipline. So as I have argued also before, an historiographical assertion can be felicitous only if and only it is accepted if it follows the rules in this particular discipline. So we have in the discipline of history a certain, you know, number of requirements, a certain number of rules and conventions, how you have to prove, how they have to make your case. And of course, these rules and conventions are not written in stone. They are, you know, constantly in change and motion. And they also there might be important varieties across cultures. But nevertheless, again, in practical terms, we can see that it works. That historians can, you know, they might disagree, but they will agree on the disagreements. What are the rules of disagreement? And I believe, again, as a sort of social practice, history writing as social practice, it is rooted in social rules, in the disciplinary behaviors, and also I would add on certain epistemic virtues that Hermann Paulus is working on. So in order to be a historian, you have to, you know, follow certain rules, to expose certain epistemic virtues, and also to be able to respond to the challenges within the field, which are made from the same set of rules. So in this case, it's a kind of game of making arguments and challenging arguments. And of course, it's never-ending process. And again, from a pragmatist point of view, any scientific truth is fallible. It is submitted to new arguments and new evidence, and has to be open to be reconsidered, to be even declared untrue or mistaken. But I believe there is a mechanism to avoid the fall into certain, you know, subjectivism or relativism. But again, it doesn't mean that it is true in the sense that it corresponds to the reality. It's true within the disciplinary matrix of, in our case, of history. I don't know, maybe it helps, but of course, I have to admit that these are a bit shaky ground, and some people are not very happy to live with this idea that actually truth is fallible.
Thank you. It's more of a like a Kuhnian type of way of seeing historiography, right? So thank you.
In many respects, yeah.
Well, thank you. I have a few questions myself. Well, and first of all, I wanted to ask you maybe to take one step back and tell us why to commit to a term, to the concept of truth. I mean, many pragmatists have already given it up and used terms like verification or warranted assertability, for example, because they consider that that it's too much of a problematic concept for historiography. And so that was my first broad question.
Let me maybe tackle it immediately. I mean, you're absolutely right, and many authors I admire, starting with Richard Rorty, have sort of advocated the giving up the idea of truth, and for instance, replacing it also by solidarity or something else. And in many respects, it makes sense. But here, I would return to this idea of practical turn, namely to follow the practice of history writing. And you will not find any historian who will say that truth is a useless concept. So I think, again, my intention is to make sense of what historians are doing. And when historians are using truth as almost the most important concept of their thinking and their work, therefore, as, let's say, from the philosophical perspective, we shouldn't tell that you're historians, you're stupid, you're still using this old-fashioned concept of truth, while, we are moved forward and we are talking about solidarity and verification and warranty. So in this respect, yeah, as an historian, I believe we still have to cope with this notion of truth. But indeed, we have to maybe bring a new light to this concept with the help of pragmatics.
Yeah, I understand. And when I was telling you about the reception that, or almost the solace that my students resented when reading your work, it has to do with that they're constantly confronted with the fact of having to give an account of the truth, which doesn't correspond to any of the main models of truth that had been given before. So in that sense, I think it's very important to have an alternative model of truth. But you say that we don't need a new model of truth, which is, and I think, even though you take into account many different authors, it is actually an alternative model of truth. And but when I was a bit concerned during your talk, it was at the very end of your talk when you gave this broad definition of the criteria it should be that should be there. And I was thinking that the only thing that was very specific to historiography was the epistemic standards in historical discipline, but that otherwise it could be applied to any other discipline. Like, for example, if I change A for epistemic standards in economic discipline or sociological, it would also be true. So here I wanted you to tell us a bit more about how specific it can become once you dwell more in that definition.
Yes, you're right, and I believe indeed that there is a lot of similarities between the function of truth as assertion in various disciplines in humanities and social sciences. So in this respect, history is not something completely different. But however, there are certain differences, and of course, the fact that history is about producing and providing evidence and interpreting the evidence, it makes it in some respects different from other disciplines because, by definition, our object of research is gun, and there is any possibilities to make it true again, make it back into life. But therefore, I do agree that most of the humanities discipline would fit with this definition I proposed, and most of the criteria I proposed. So in this respect, I think the key difference is about the methods of justification in historiographic assertion. and his methods of justification are first and foremost depending on the use and interpretation of evidence. And I was not able to discuss today very much about this idea of evidence in history writing. I have some ideas expressed in the article I mentioned, because it's a tricky concept, and evidence is very much what historian considers to be evidence for his or her argument. But roughly, yes, historiographic assertion has its certain peculiarities, but in general, it's very similar to other types of assertions in other scientific disciplines, especially in humanities and social sciences.
Thank you. We have a new question from Guillermo.
I just want to ask if nobody else raises his hand. But if that is not the case, then perhaps I would like to say something about truth in history, because I think that that's a hot topic. Aurelia has pushed you, Marek, to get rid of the idea of history. I mean, but
idea of truth, you mean? Yeah. To get rid of idea of truth. Yeah.
Getting rid of the idea of truth. Well, a little bit in as Richard Rorty said that well, we can get rid of the idea of truth. It's an old concept. We will do much better if we don't use truth. However, you think, Marek, that truth is important because it is still a central concept in the practice of historians. But in that case, your argument comes from that side of your position that defends the practical term. Whereas I think that you could still give an argument in favor of truth from my pragmatist point of view, a purely pragmatist point of view. I think that when Aurelia says, and with a lot of reason, I think, something that historians, I think, face this problem frequently, that the traditional concept of truth gives them headaches. A solution, I think, that would fit very well in your position is simply that what we have to get rid is not of the concept of truth in general, but of the traditional concept of truth. And that if we adopt a pragmatist view of truth, say, for example, as William James told us, then the usefulness of truth in history will reveal itself to be very important. Why? Because one way of understanding William James' definition of truth is that once we get rid of this idea that truth is correspondence and the truth is what works for us, then we have to incorporate within our conception of truth other values, particularly the good, what is good for us, but what is good for humanity in general. And I think that this idea of combining truth to the facts, and what is good for us, good for humanity, can be extremely useful for history. Because particularly if we think of history not only as a science of what happened in the past, but also of a conception of history that could be more linked to wisdom and to the view of history as a teacher of humanity, you see, not only as a social science, but as a part of humanities, and in that sense, very connected to philosophy. When we get rid of the concept of truth, we weaken the conception of history as a part of wisdom, of human wisdom. Perhaps we could help the development of history as a social science, but we will lose a lot, you see, if we get rid of the notion of truth when we want to claim that history is a teacher of humanity. So I think that what I find very interesting, appealing of of a pragmatist philosophy of history is precisely this idea that what we get is a much more complex, much more wider, much more interesting conception of truth that can really help history not only as a discipline that belongs to social sciences, but a discipline that belongs to the humanities in the most strong sense of humanities that we get from the Greeks, from the ancient Greeks. So I don't know what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's very good and attractive idea, but it means also falling back to this normative philosophy of history, meaning that philosophers will have to tell the historians what kind of truth or theory of truth they have to adopt or follow. And this is very risky because, again, it sounds good as an idea, and in very much I'm very sympathetic to this, but I am very pessimistic about the perspectives of convincing all historians to espouse this pragmatic idea of truth. So again, to come back to the very beginning of my talk, I don't believe that philosophers or philosophy should take this stance to tell the historians what they should do in order to, build a better world. But rather, we should try to, make theoretically explicit what they are doing. But then, of course, I have to admit that that all the discussion of the day has been about the philosophy of historiography, of historical research. But then I am myself also interested in philosophy of history in a more general sense, in more speculative sense. And also the projects that I'm currently involved in, mentioned also by Aurelia, for instance, the role of the notion of future in making sense of the past. And this is something much more wider, and it's not about history in the sense of academic history writing, but history in the sense of our relations with the past, be it whatever kind of field or domain, including literature and film and all other media which give us a relation with the past. So, and in this respect, I believe indeed that as philosophers and also philosophers of history, we should provide some new ideas about how to, let's say, redefine our relations with the past. And I believe that in current major changes in technology, in environment, and in many other fields, actually should have an impact on our way of making sense of the past. And probably in order to resolve the problems we are facing currently in the world, we need a completely new idea of history, of the past, including modern human history and multi-species history and all other forms of history. And in this respect, I'm indeed very much normative. I would like to provide ideas how to redefine the whole idea of history as we know it. But again, today, when we're discussing more specifically the philosophy of historiography, of historical research, then I would rather adopt this descriptive position and actually try to conceptualize and theorize the empirical work of historians.
We have a question by Atocha Liceda.
Hello. Marek, thank you very much for your talk, and first of all to Aurelia for bringing someone here at the Institute, even though virtually, I know, to speak about pragmatism. However, I am, as I was listening to you, I have to say that I was becoming more and more skeptical, if not doubtful, of you really bringing a pragmatist theory of truth. Why? Because I think that if you align or you want to use the notion of assertion you just say, well, assertion, as John Searle conceives it, is a commitment to truth. And then you go through Brandom, and he talks about, well, it's not really truth, but as if true. So maybe this is a problem, at least of Brandom, of how he interprets truth. Thinking that that's a pragmatist theory of truth. But my question then, and especially because you come from Finland, my question would be, why not adopting a notion of truth-likeness, which is a notion by Ilkka Niiniluoto, who in turn takes this notion of Peirce. Peirce did not think about truth. I think of everything you said, he would like to say that an assertion is rather a hypothesis. Why not talk about hypothesis? But trying to have a conversation with you within your own notions and concepts, what I would really ask you is, well, if you are so committed to truth, my question would be, what ontological commitments you have from a historiographic perspective? You think historians are approaching to truth because there is a real world or a real event that happened and they have to discover how it really happened? I am aware that I am not phrasing a precise question. Rather, of course, this is a comment. And only because by coincidence, I am preparing a commentary to Niiniluoto's new book, which is, by the way, called Abduction as Truth-Seeking. He doesn't talk about truth, but truth-seeking. So I think my question here is a bit more clear. My impression is that if you want to really follow the pragmatist spirit or attitude, pragmatists themselves don't want to talk about the philosophy of pragmatism. It's an attitude. And in this respect, it's not the concept of truth, but it's truth-seeking. So, two questions. What is your commitment to truth-likeness or truth-seeking? And the second is, do you have an ontological commitment to some form of realism? And of course, I'm very critical, but I think your talk is so very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of interesting, important remarks and questions. And I do admit that this, what I call the pragmatist perspective in philosophy of history, or even a pragmatist philosophy of history, is a very specific use of the term pragmatism. As I try to explain it, it's a very kind of mixed, comprehensive notion of pragmatism. And I indeed don't follow, let's say, all main ideas of the pragmatist theory of truth, as it was, defined by James Dewey and many others, even Rorty. But I try to, put together my own sort of stance, mostly relying on the pragmatics as linguistics. So it's when I call it the pragmatist philosophy of history, I should probably call it rather pragmatic philosophy of history. So indeed, so the very foundation of my theory is the speech act theory, and not let's say the Jamesian Deweyan pragmatist theory of truth. And indeed, let's say I don't have any strong ontological commitment in the sense that, well, if you like, I would call myself maybe anti-realist, definitely not realist. And I believe that that I understand truth quite similarly, I believe, to Peirce, meaning as a kind of inquiry toward truth, which is again submitted to this principle of fallibilism, namely that we are formulating certain arguments that are challenged in the future, that will remain, and even are maybe more pessimistic than Peirce, who foresee kind of a moment when these different theories will kind of collide or come together. I believe this is open-ended truth seeking, and indeed, I believe. I mean, if I should translate my approach into terms you provided, indeed, truth seeking is probably the most useful one. But as to the Ilkka Niiniluoto, I know quite well his work, but I mean, for me, he's a different philosophical tradition. It's very strongly rooted in analytic philosophy, and I do admit that we could probably use his vocabulary to, let's say, explain or translate some of my ideas into his language. But still, it's very different philosophical world, at least in my reading. So there is, again, one has to make choices in making up one's conceptual toolbox. And again, my idea is to observe as closely as possible what historians are doing and conceptualize it in terms of pragmatics language, let's say, and therefore I believe that I still would stick this idea of truth because it belongs to the vocabulary of historians, but I try to explain what truth means in pragmatic terms in historiography, in history writing. So truth is making assertoric speech acts, which entails certain commitments and entitlements and etc. But yes, your criticism.
Thank you.
Okay, good.
Okay, we have a question now from Raimundo.
Thank you, Marek. I think I'm starting to understand much better your proposal. And I liked very much what I understood of your answers to Aurelia, to Guillermo, and to Atocha. I would like to know how much I could push you in that direction to make these important distinctions. Because it looks like we're talking about at least three different things: the pragmatical turn, the practical turn, and the pragmatist turn. And you don't have to be committed to all of them. Actually, during your presentation, you mentioned that beautiful essay by Gabay and Woods, The Practical Turn in Logic, which is very dear to my heart. They start distinguishing this interest in focusing on not only the products, but also the process, not only the histories, like Hesiod calls them, but also the act of writing history. The writing of history is different from the histories. The focus not only on the normative legitimacy, but also the descriptive adequacy of your philosophy of history. The paying attention to the actual circumstances. And not only insist that the ideal circumstances are the ones that you have to take care of, and everything actually will be just an approximation to them. So when they say, let's take care of these things, they're talking about a renewed interest in I'm quoting, the contingencies of human reasoning as they play out in real life contexts. Collectively, we may denote this as the practical turn. So that is very neutral. We can say, let's be careful, lest we idealize too much and prescribe instead of describing when we were trying to understand the phenomenon. Be very careful that what we think historians should do doesn't obscure what they're actually doing. But of course, sometimes what historians do is wrong. Sometimes what historians think they're doing is not right on the money. we have to take that with a grain of salt. It has to be a prudential combination of things. The practical turn doesn't mean don't consider the theoretical ideal aspect, just don't consider only that. Enrich your theory. Don't forget reality when you're talking about the practice of history, so that you can have both descriptive and prescriptive force in your theory. Now, if we say, in order to do that, we have to pay attention to the language, to what they're saying. And that has a lot of pragmatic components. That can be incorporated in this practical turn without going all the way to the pragmatist ideas. And one problem is that there are so many pragmatist theories and so many practical terms that it's very easy to conflate them. So what can you tell us to help us uncouple these notions so that we don't confuse them and think that in order to be faithful to what really happens, we have to go all the way to these philosophical theories that really take a very heavy stance about very difficult questions that most historians don't really need to grapple with in order to do their job correctly. So how can we uncouple these notions and be able to make these distinctions and not sound like we are confusing pragmatist, pragmatical, and practical terms? What can you recommend, Marek?
Thank you. This was, again, very inspiring comment and good question. But actually, yes, my stance is very much the opposite. Namely, I don't want to uncouple these three layers, but actually want to bring them together. And this is, of course, very risky business, as we can also, see from the feedback, that these are indeed, on the one hand, very different phenomena, the practical, pragmatic, and pragmatist. But however, I believe there is some certain continuity, certain connections, and also I try to give you some quotes from people who also believe into these connections, starting with Robert Brandom, who also connects the practical, the pragmatic, and pragmatist in his works. And so maybe you're right that it would make sense to keep these as separate as possible, and so to have more clarified picture. But on the other hand, I believe that in combining these three perspectives and these three approaches, we also might gain something, to discover something new, something unexpected. But of course, the risk is to create certain misunderstandings and certain, confusions. But however, I believe that if properly defined and explained, it might be possible to combine the practical, pragmatic, and pragmatist turns into one sort of philosophical platform to making sense of what historians are doing.
Good luck with that, Mark.
Thank you.
Well, I think I have still a few more questions, and I want to take advantage of the opportunity to have you here, so I won't let you go so soon. I wanted you, if you could tell us a bit more about, you said that a historiographical account might be felicitous or unfelicitous, because we take it, we understand it from the point of view of speech acts. But I wanted to ask you whether we can still talk of a false account of history, for example, and what would be the criteria. I think also by taking it on the negative side, your own concept of truth would be easier to grasp.
Yes, but I believe that the answer to this question, how to make a difference between, false to falsified, or, whatever kind of history, the answer relies within these disciplinary rules, so that there is a possibility to criticize from the disciplinary perspective, let's say, the false accounts of the past, and that's important. I mean, as in the case of almost any speech act, the social context is very important. Who is making the speech act, and in what context? And when one is making an historiographic assertion, which is not considered as appropriate, meaning is not felicitous, is not following the rules of the discipline, it can be called as infelicitous or false or mistaken or whatever. And we have plenty of examples of this kind of cases in the history of historiography, that the accounts that are collectively, within the discipline, considered as false because not following the let's say the rules or the best practices, the epistemic virtues of the discipline. But they could sometimes function as true for a certain amount of time until they are challenged properly and declared false or untrue. So I believe that there's within, let's say, my approach, we can still argue that certain historiographic accounts are false, are mistaken, because they misread the evidence, or they lack certain evidence, or simply they are not based on any evidence at all. Yeah, but that's a separate discussion, of course, about this whole idea of how to cope with, let's say, the denials of certain historical events, etc. And of course, at certain point, it becomes also very much ethical question, which transcends, let's say, this epistemological perspective, which is mine.
Yeah, and I was asking that because some historians worry that once you let go of the referent, history can be easily confused with either fiction, and that you can also not tell what a forgery really is, because it actually complies to every single standard in the discipline and still is false or is mistaken. So that's what I was. That's what I was asking about. And my very last question has to do with what you just mentioned, and it's the ethical and political implications of this concept of truth, which are, of course, embedded in the same institution and also in the practical aspect of it. But when you say that like a main notion is being responsible for what you're saying, the ethical dimension really has like a central place. So I wanted to ask you about it.
Yeah, this is a very complicated and tricky issue, how to combine the ethical and epistemological approaches. And I think the first things to be made clear is that all this, let's say, theoretical model I'm arguing for works within the, let's call it simply, within the democratic society, without within the discipline, without any external coercion. Because, of course, let's say, in a totalitarian society, this sort of game of making arguments and accepting arguments is very different. And there are a lot of, there is no, let's say, autonomy of historiographical knowledge production. And therefore, the whole system in a way collapses. So you need certain space of freedom in order to have the historiographical assertion functioning in the way I try to describe. So this is first important thing. But otherwise, I believe that these ethical principles are very much embedded in the epistemological situation of historical truth production. And again, I'm referring to Hermann Paul's work, the Epistemic Virtues, that actually within this discipline of history, where this again, this game is played about making historical assertions and accepting them. It includes certain virtues that is valorized within the discipline, within this field. You have to be, honest, sincere, integrative, whatever. This is part of the epistemological package of the historians active in this discipline, in this field. So in this respect, I don't see any major difference between ethical and epistemological problems. But again, it has to be within this context of relative academic freedom to play these, let's say, academic games in the good sense of the term.
Well, I think that's it for the questions so far. And I just wanted to thank you again for joining us and for answering all of our doubts that came up during your talk. I think a few of us in the Institute have become very much interested or have been working for some time in philosophy of history. And having the opportunity to talk with you has been, very inspiring. And I think we're living with a lot of new ideas and questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And it's always a pleasure to talk about philosophy of history. And I enjoyed very much your comments and questions. I learned myself very much. So thank you. And hopefully see you in a real life one day.
Hopefully, yes.
Okay. Then goodbye and thank you.